How many people know the concept of imaginary numbers? Okay. There are a few scientists in our midst. Imaginary numbers, I didn't realize this till I looked it up preparing for this message, that imaginary numbers date back very, very far. And Descartes, who's one of the big principles of, or forebearers of various aspects of mathematics and so forth, talked about imaginary numbers, although he talked about them in a very discouraging way because he didn't believe they were worth anything. When I started learning about them in my physics and chemistry and mathematics courses at Pitt, and I tried to explain it to Krista, she said, no, imaginary numbers, they're just imaginary. They can't be. You know, so how could you use those for anything? Makes no sense. And I have to say I agree with her. And, you know, here you go. One example of an imaginary number is to have something, I don't want to get too far afield here, but if you remember the concept of squares and square roots, if you multiply any two numbers, if you multiply the same number together, regardless of whether it's, you know, positive or negative, if you multiply two positive numbers together, you get a positive number. If you multiply two negative numbers together, you get a negative. So if you take the same number, whether it's positive or negative, and you multiply it together, you will always get a positive result. So, which therefore, the square root of something, which is to figure out what is the number you multiply by itself to get a square, the square root of it always has to be positive, right? It's only logical. And so the one of the imaginary numbers is the idea of a negative square root, that there's a negative number that is the square root of a number, which is impossible or imaginary. Why in the world do you need to know this? Because the way we count righteousness, we have a tendency to make the same kind of error, if you want to call it an error, in inventing imaginary numbers. They aren't real. In fact, in mathematics, they're contrasted with things that are called real numbers. There are real numbers and there are imaginary numbers. And imaginary numbers don't represent anything of a physical nature, but they are used in complex calculations to figure something out, and somehow or other they work. Or at least people imagine that they work, right? But it's taking something that is in contrast to one of the basic tenets of mathematics in order to make it work. And we do the same thing erroneously many times in understanding our place in the Lord and understanding the requirements of our Lord and understanding who we are in Jesus Christ and what our relationship genuinely is. And there's lots of reasons for it. You could probably blame your mom and dad, you know, because they taught you right from wrong, maybe. And if they did that, they probably taught you incorrectly, or at least they put into your mind certain things about forgiveness and right and wrong that were incorrect. Because they were taught those things, and others were taught those things, going back to Adam and Eve and the understanding of what's right and what's wrong and what the concept of forgiveness really is and what it really means to be righteous. Now, back in the 60s, we used to talk about something was really righteous, man, meaning it was really cool and probably sinful, because most things we thought were cool were sinful in the 60s. But righteousness in the context of religion for most people means always doing the right thing, and the measure of your righteousness is how much you do the right things. And we have that calculation, and we have our own set of scales in our mind. And we calibrate it to our own thinking of what's right and what's wrong. And so we tip the scales a little bit in terms of how wrong something is wrong because we happen to really like that wrong. Or we are one who practices that wrong, and so we tip the scales a little bit and we come up with concepts like mortal and venial. And anyone who grew up in the Roman Catholic Church knows exactly what I'm talking about. It used to be, at least when I grew up, 50 years ago going to Catholic school, I learned that there were venial sins and mortal sins, little sins and big sins. And you commit the venial sins, the little ones, and you die before confession, well, it's okay. It just means you'll spend somewhere between 1 and 10 bazillion years in purgatory being purged of that sin, but then you'll get into heaven eventually. A mortal sin, on the other hand, no, it's kind of like, Monopoly. Go to hell, go straight to hell. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. It's the wrong concept of righteousness, of counting what we have done, what we are doing, what we are not doing. Are those things important? Absolutely. Absolutely. But are they the basis of our relationship with God through Jesus Christ? Absolutely not.